In the Underworld, trust is a death sentence. So what happens when the man who rules the shadows falls for the woman paid to destroy him? Albert Avellino is the undisputed king of the syndicate. Cold, tactical, untouchable. He built his empire on one rule: emotion gets you killed. For a decade, that logic kept him alive. Then came Julieta Chun. She arrived in blood-red silk with no fear in her eyes and a file that could burn his enemies to ash. A whisperer who played both sides and somehow stayed breathing. She was dangerous, intelligent, and knew too much about his operation. Their alliance became an obsession. And now a terrifying question haunts him. Is she his perfect partner, or the trap designed to end him? In a city where every glance is a threat, Albert's about to learn that his heart was stolen by a beautiful informant. And loving her might be the deadliest mistake he'll ever make. This is the story of how the most feared man in the city ended up on his knees for a woman whose very existence was a lie. And it all began on a rain-soaked shipyard where a ghost in a red dress changed everything. The rain fell in relentless, icy sheets over the port of Aegis, transforming the industrial landscape into a graveyard of rusted steel and forgotten dreams. The downpour was so heavy it seemed to erase the boundary between sky and earth, turning the world into a gray, waterlogged blur. Albert Avellino stood beneath the skeletal shadow of a massive shipping crane, his tailored black coat absorbing the rain like a second skin. His face was a mask of granite, immovable, unreadable, carved from the same cold stone that formed the foundation of his empire. To his left and right, his men stood like statues carved from violence itself, their hands hovering near the cold grips of their weapons. These weren't ordinary enforcers. These were men who had killed for him, bled for him, and would die for him without a moment's hesitation. Each one had been personally selected by Albert, tested in the crucible of the city's most brutal conflicts, and found worthy of standing in his shadow. The atmosphere was heavy, suffocating with the kind of tension that usually preceded either a fortune or funeral. And in Albert's experience, the two were often interchangeable. Albert Avellino did not believe in accidents. He believed in variables, in the cold mathematics of power, and in the brutal certainty that every outcome could be predicted if you had enough information. Tonight, the variables were supposed to be beautifully simple. A handover of high-grade encrypted technology for a substantial sum of untraceable cash. The kind of transaction that had built his empire, brick by bloody brick. But the silence of the docks was too deep, too complete. The darkness between the shipping containers felt too hungry, too alive with possibilities he hadn't accounted for. He checked his watch. A vintage Patek Philippe that had belonged to his father. One of the few sentimental items he allowed himself to keep. The contact was 17 minutes late. In Albert's world, being late was often the first symptom of a setup, the initial crack in facade that preceded total collapse. His mind ran to the possibilities with machine-like efficiency: ambush, betrayal, law enforcement, rival faction. Each scenario played out in his head with brutal clarity, along with the appropriate tactical response. Then, like a discordant note in a symphony of rain, the rhythm changed. Out of the industrial gloom, a figure emerged from between two massive shipping containers marked with faded Chinese characters. It wasn't the scarred, nervous middleman Albert had been expecting. A low-level operator who moved contraband for a living and looked over his shoulder with every breath. This was something else entirely. It was a woman. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed to mock the lethality of the armed men surrounding her. Each step was measured, purposeful, as though she were walking down a red carpet instead of through a potentially deadly situation. She wore a striking crimson gown that seemed to bleed against the gray, metallic backdrop of the shipyard. The fabric clung to her curves like a second skin, a defiant splash of color in a world dominated by shadows and steel. The dress was audacious, almost insulting in its boldness, a middle finger to every rule of survival in the underworld. This was Julieta Chun, though Albert didn't know her name yet. All he knew was that every instinct he possessed was screaming that this woman was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with weapons. Albert's men shifted immediately, their training taking over. Guns clicked as they leveled their sights on her chest, red laser dots dancing across the wet silk of her dress. 8 weapons, 8 men who could drop a target at this range without breaking a sweat. The message was clear. One wrong move and she would be dead before she hit the ground. Julieta didn't flinch. She didn't even slow down. She stopped exactly 10 paces from Albert, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to give his men a clear shot if needed. Her dark hair was slicked back by the rain, revealing the sharp, elegant lines of her face. Her eyes reflected the dim orange glow of the distant city lights. But there was something else in them, a clinical, piercing intelligence that seemed to dissect everything she saw. She looked at the most dangerous man in the city not with the fear that Albert had come to expect, not with a trembling submission that usually greeted him, but with a calm, almost amused curiosity. Albert found himself struck by her composure in the face of certain death. Most people trembled when he looked at them, their pulse visible in the hollows of their throats, their breathing shallow and desperate. Julieta stood perfectly still, her breath steady and controlled, her gaze unwavering. She was a puzzle he hadn't prepared for, an equation that didn't balance according to rules he knew. She didn't come with a weapon. She came with something far more dangerous. Information. Julieta held out a thick, waterproof envelope, the kind used to protect documents from exactly this kind of weather. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was smooth and low, carrying over the roar of the wind and rain with effortless clarity. There was an accent there, something that spoke of international education and careful cultivation. "Your shipment isn't the only thing being moved tonight, Mr. Avellino," she said, her tone conversational, as though they were discussing the weather rather than standing in what could become her execution ground. "While you're busy watching the horizon, someone inside your own house is cutting the floor out from under you. The foundation you spent 10 years building is already crumbling, and you don't even know it yet." Albert didn't move to take the envelope. He simply watched her, his cold logic running through every possible scenario with the speed of a supercomputer. He knew her reputation, or at least he knew the legend. The Whisperer, an independent informant who somehow managed to play the triads against the syndicate and vice versa, selling secrets to the highest bidder while maintaining a precarious balance that should have gotten her killed a dozen times over. She was a ghost who navigated the deadly friction between the city's power players, turning information into survival with an artist's precision. The question was, why was she here? Why had she broken her pattern of anonymity to stand in front of him personally? Albert signaled for his lead enforcer, a mountain of a man named Dominic who had been with him since the beginning, to take the file. As Dominic stepped forward, his massive frame blocking out what little light there was, Albert maintained eye contact with Julieta. He let the silence stretch, an interrogation technique he had perfected over years of extracting truth from liars. "Why are you bringing this to me instead of the authorities?" Albert finally asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "Or better yet, why not take it to my rivals? I'm sure the triads would pay handsomely for information about a mole in my organization." Her answer came with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The syndicate is stable, Mr. Avellino. Stability is good for business. My business. The triads are fractured, paranoid, constantly at each other's throats. They're unreliable clients who are just as likely to kill the messenger as pay them. You, on the other hand..." She paused, letting the rain run down her face like tears she would never shed. "You're predictable. You follow a code. You value information. And you always pay your debts." But there was more to it than that. Albert could see in the flash of something dangerous in her eyes, a spark of defiance that suggested she enjoyed this. Enjoyed standing in the shadow of death, enjoyed the razor's edge between survival and obliteration. She was an adrenaline addict disguised as a businesswoman, and that made her even more unpredictable. Dominic opened the file with thick fingers, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. Albert watched his enforcer's face carefully, looking for tells. What he saw made his blood run cold, though his expression remained unchanged. The color drained from Dominic's weathered face, replaced by a pale shot that Albert had only seen a handful of times in their decade-long partnership. The enforcer leaned in close, his voice barely audible over the storm. He whispered 3 names, names that Albert knew as well as his own, men who had sat at his table, men who had broken bread with him and swore blood oaths, men who, according to this file, had been systematically leaking his shipping routes to a rival organization for the past 6 months. The betrayal hit closer to home than Albert had dared to imagine, but he didn't let it show. Emotion was a weapon others could use against you, and he had learned long ago to keep it loaded and holstered where no one could reach it. Albert looked back at the woman in the red dress. This whisperer who had just handed him evidence of a coup that could have destroyed everything. In that moment, staring into those intelligent, fearless eyes, he realized something that chilled him more than the rain. He was no longer the one in control of this exchange. Julieta Chun had given him his empire back by exposing the rot within it. But in doing so, she had planted a seed of curiosity that his legendary logic couldn't extinguish. She had created a debt, and debts in his world were chains that bound people together, sometimes until death. The price, Albert said simply. Everything had a price. Your protection, Julieta replied without hesitation. The authorities are closing in on me. They want to use me to bring down everyone. You, the triads, everyone. I need sanctuary, and you're the only one powerful enough to provide it. The transaction was over, but the haunting of Albert Avellino had just begun. As she turned to vanish back into the rain, moving with that same unhurried grace, Albert didn't order his men to follow her. He didn't order them to verify her story or check her for weapons or recording devices. He just watched the red silk disappear into the dark like a drop of blood dissolving in water, knowing with absolute certainty that his world had just changed forever. Dominic stepped close, his voice urgent. Boss! This will be a setup. We should. Let her go, Albert said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the spot where she had vanished. But I want to know everything about her. Where she lives, who she talks to, what she eats for breakfast. Everything. And Dominic? Verify those names in the file. If they're accurate, handle it personally. Quietly. As he climbed into the back of his armored sedan, the waterproof envelope heavy in his hand, Albert Avellino made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life. He was going to bring the Whisperer into his inner circle. He was going to give her access to the very heart of his operation. It was, he would later realize, the moment he signed his own death warrant, or his salvation. In the world of shadows where he lived, the two were often identical until the very end. The taillights of the vehicle that had whisked Julieta Chin away bled into the heavy downpour like wounds in the night, fading to nothing as they disappeared around a corner marked by a burnt-out streetlight. Albert Avellino remained standing in the rain long after she had gone, the waterproof envelope heavy in his hand, while his men waited for a command that didn't immediately come. They were used to his silences. Albert was a man who thought in chess moves, always several steps ahead. But this silence felt different. Heavier, more dangerous. The logic that usually governed his life, that cold mathematical certainty that had kept him alive through a decade of gang wars and political maneuvering, dictated a clear course of action. Burn the file and eliminate the woman who brought it. Information brokers were never to be trusted. They sold their loyalty to the highest bidder and switched sides as easily as changing clothes. Bringing one into his organization was like inviting a viper into his bed. Eventually, inevitably, you would be bitten. But Albert didn't give that order. Instead, he climbed into the back of his armored sedan, the vehicle modified with reinforced steel plating and bulletproof glass thick enough to stop a .50 caliber round. He gave the driver a single destination, the estate. The drive back was a blur of neon lights reflecting off wet asphalt, the city passing by like a fevered dream of commerce and corruption. But Albert's mind was anchored firmly to the contents of the file, resting on the leather seat beside him. Within an hour, he was behind a massive oak desk of his private study, a room built like a bunker within the heart of his sprawling fortress of an estate. The study was Albert's sanctum, a space where the chaos of the underworld couldn't reach him. The air here was dry and smelled of old leather and expensive tobacco, a sharp contrast to the damp decay of the shipyard. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined two walls, filled with first editions and volumes on military strategy, psychology, and power dynamics. A third wall held screens showing feeds from the dozens of security cameras scattered throughout the property. The fourth was dominated by a massive oil painting of his father, a stern-faced man who had built the foundation of the Avellino Empire before a rival's bullet had ended his reign. Albert didn't call for a drink, though a bottle of 30-year-old scotch sat on the sideboard. He didn't call for his advisors, though several of them were undoubtedly waiting in the adjacent rooms, curious about the late-night rendezvous at the docks. He simply sat in the darkness, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and watched the door. He had sent the message to Julieta-chan through an encrypted channel before he'd even left the shipyard. "Come to the estate. We have business to discuss." "Come alone." It was a test, of course. If she was genuinely seeking sanctuary, she would come. If this was an elaborate setup, if she was working with law enforcement or a rival faction, she would vanish or arrive with company. 47 minutes later, the door opened, and Julieta-chan was escorted inside by two of Albert's most trusted men. They looked uncomfortable, their weapons trained on her despite the fact that she'd been thoroughly searched at the gate. She had changed out of the soaked red silk into a tailored black pantsuit that looked like armor in its own right. The outfit was expensive. Albert recognized a cut of Italian tailoring when he saw it, but practical. Her hair was still damp, clinging to the pale curve of her neck in a way that drew the eye despite the severity of her clothing. But it was her eyes that held Albert's attention. That same piercing, clinical intelligence that had unsettled him at the port, now focused entirely on him with an intensity that felt almost physical. She didn't wait to be invited to sit. She walked to the center of the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, her presence somehow filling the space in a way that made the reinforced walls feel inadequate. "The names in that file have already been verified," Albert said without preamble, his voice a low vibration that carried no warmth. He leaned forward into the pool of light cast by the desk lamp, his face becoming a landscape of hard angles and shadow. "Two of them are men who have sat at my table for years, broken bread with me, swore oaths that should have been binding. One of them oversaw my security in the Northern District. He had access to nearly every operation I run in that sector." He paused, letting the weight of that betrayal hang in the air between them. "You've given me a massacre, Julieta-chan," he continued, using her name for the first time. "A bloodbath that's going to echo through every level of my organization. Men are going to die because of what's in that file. So now, before I decide whether you're the fourth body on that list, tell me exactly why I shouldn't start that massacre with you." Julieta didn't flinch. She stood before the most feared man in the city and looked at him like a puzzle she had already solved, a problem that held no mystery for her analytical mind. "Because a massacre without a plan is just a mess, Albert," she replied, her tone conversational, almost bored. A calculated show of confidence that was either genuine fearlessness or an impressive performance. "And you don't do messy. You didn't bring me here to kill me in your study, like some cliché mob boss. You brought me here because you realize something that terrifies you more than any betrayal. For all your power, for all your careful planning and strategic brilliance, you are blind to the rot inside your own house." She took a step closer to the desk, her movements controlled and deliberate. "You need eyes that aren't clouded by loyalty or brotherhood or years of shared history," she continued. "You need someone who can see your organization the way your enemies see it, as a system with exploitable weaknesses. You need me, Albert, and we both know it." The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Outside the heavy oak doors, Albert could hear the low, agitated murmurs of his inner circle. They were men who had bled for the syndicate, men who viewed this mysterious whisperer as a viper in their nest, and they wanted her gone. Their suspicion was a physical weight pressing against the door, threatening to burst through and demand her immediate execution. Dominic's voice rose above the others, loud enough to penetrate the thick wood. "Boss, you can't trust her. She's a fucking information broker. She'll sell us out the first chance she gets." Albert held up a hand, a small gesture that nevertheless carried absolute authority. The voices outside fell silent immediately. "Information is never free," Albert reminded Julieta, his cold logic returning to the surface like ice forming over deep water. "You're a whisperer. You navigate the friction between the triads and my people. You've made a career out of playing both sides. So tell me, Julieta, why choose a side now? What's changed?" "I'm not choosing a side. I'm choosing a sanctuary," she said, stepping closer to the desk until only a few feet separated them. She explained with clinical precision. The authorities were tightening the noose, using her past to pull her leash. There were charges they could file. Old warrants from her early days as an information broker, connections to unsolved cases, digital footprints that could be twisted into conspiracy charges. They wanted to flip her, to turn her into their pet informant against every major criminal organization in the city. The only place they couldn't reach, the only walls thick enough to keep them out, were his. I'm not asking for mercy, Julieta continued. I'm proposing a merger. You get an analyst who knows your enemies better than they know themselves. I get a roof over my head and protection from people who would happily bury me in a federal prison for the next 30 years. It's a business transaction, Albert. The kind you built your empire on. They spent the next 2 hours bartering in the cold language of the underground, negotiating terms with the precision of corporate lawyers, but with far deadlier consequences for breach of contract. Every time Albert tried to corner her with a question designed to expose a lie or reveal her true motivations, she parried with a detail about his operation that should have been locked away in his most secure files. She knew about the shipment route through the industrial district that he'd personally designed. She knew about the protection money paid by 3 councilmen who were supposed to be untouchable. She knew about the warehouse in the port district that officially didn't exist on any of his ledgers. She wasn't just an informant. She was a predator of data, someone who collected secrets the way other people collected art. How do you know all this? Albert demanded at one point, his composure cracking slightly. Because I'm good at my job, Julieta replied with a slight smile. And because your enemies talk to me, hoping I'll give them the keys to your kingdom. I never did, until tonight. By the time the clock on the wall struck 3 a.m, a deal had been forged in the shadows. Julieta would become his exclusive eyes and ears, an independent contractor within the syndicate who answered only to him. She would have no contact with the Triads or any other rival organizations. In return, she would receive a staggering fee, enough to disappear and start a new life anywhere in the world when the contract ended, and the absolute protection of the Avellino name. Albert stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room that seemed to swallow Julieta whole. He extended a hand across the desk, the gesture formal and businesslike. But when her fingers brushed his, something unexpected happened. The professional mask he wore, that carefully constructed facade of cold calculation, slipped for a fraction of a second. There was a dark, magnetic pull between them, a dangerous current of attraction that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the vulnerability he was beginning to feel. It was like touching a live wire, a jolt of electricity that was both thrilling and terrifying. Albert pulled his hand back quickly, as though he'd been burned. I'll have my men prepare the guest suite in the East Wing, he said, his voice slightly rougher than before, betraying the emotion he was trying to suppress. It's secure, comfortable, and far enough from the main quarters that you'll have privacy. Make sure it has a good lock, Julieta replied with a faint, knowing smile that suggested she'd felt that current too. Not for me, for your men. They look like they want to skip the interrogation and go straight to the execution. As she was led out of the study by 2 grim-faced guards, Albert sat back down heavily in his leather chair and stared at the empty space she had occupied. The room still seemed to vibrate with her presence, as though she'd left some part of herself behind. He had just invited a beautiful informant into his fortress, a woman whose very profession was built on deception and betrayal. He had secured a valuable asset who could help him root out the cancer in his organization and stay ahead of his enemies. That was the logical justification, the rational explanation he would give to Dominic and the others. But as he watched the door close and listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor, Albert wondered if he had just handed the keys to his empire to the only person who knew exactly how to burn it down. And more disturbing than that, part of him didn't care. The lock on the study door clicked with finality that echoed to the quiet hallway, but it did little to silence the storm brewing within the walls of the estate. Albert remained at his desk long into the night. The ghost of Julieta's knowing smile burned into his mind like an afterimage. He was a man who had lived by the blade of his own logic for over a decade. Yet for the first time since he'd taken the throne, that blade felt dull and unreliable. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the damage had been done. The city was a different place now. Or perhaps it was the same city, and he was the one who had changed. Either way, Albert Avellino knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He opened a file Julieta had given him and began to read, preparing for the bloodbath that would come with the dawn. The following morning arrived with gray, reluctant dawn that seemed to mock the very concept of new beginnings. The sun struggled to pierce the thick canopy of pollution and clouds that perpetually hung over the city, casting the Avellino estate in a sickly, muted light that made everything look washed out and lifeless. Albert stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his tactical room, his hands clasped behind his back in a military posture he'd adopted years ago, looking out over the manicured gardens that had a sophisticated network of motion sensors and armed guards. Behind him, the air was thick with a different kind of heat, the suffocating atmosphere of resentment and barely contained rage. His inner circle had gathered for an emergency meeting, and the mood was toxic. The tactical room was designed for exactly this purpose. Strategy sessions, crisis management, and the cold calculus of violence. A large steel table dominated the center, its surface marked with years of planning sessions and briefings. Screens lined one wall, currently displaying security feeds from across the estate. The room smelled of coffee, gun oil, and particular tension that came before men made decisions that would end in bloodshed. Dominic, Albert's most loyal enforcer and a man who had taken 3 bullets for the syndicate on separate occasions, slammed a hand onto the steel briefing table with enough force to make the coffee cups jump. He was a bear, a man 6'4" and built like a linebacker, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of a mountain and then beaten with a hammer for good measure. Scars traced patterns across his knuckles and forearms. The permanent record of a life spent enforcing Albert's will with brutal efficiency. "You brought a fucking whisper into our house, boss," Dominic growled, his voice rough from years of shouting orders and cigarettes. "A woman who makes her living selling secrets to the highest bidder. A ghost who survived by playing every faction against each other. And you put her in the East Wing, gave her access to our security protocols, and expect us to just smile and nod." The other men around the table murmured their agreement. There was Marco, the financial wizard who laundered money through a dozen shell corporations. There was Vincent, who ran the protection rackets with ruthless efficiency. There was Carlos, whose network of informants normally provided the intelligence the syndicate relied on, and who now felt threatened by Julieta's very existence. "She's a parasite," Carlos spat, his accent thickening with anger. "She'll attach herself to our operation, suck out everything she can, and then sell it to whoever offers her a better deal. That's what she does. That's what she is." They argued that bringing a whisperer into the heart of their operation was an invitation to catastrophe. They spoke of her history with the Triads, reminding Albert that a woman who sold secrets for a living had no concept of the blood oath, no understanding of the brotherhood that held the syndicate together. Dominic's voice was the loudest, a gravelly warning that cut through the others' objections like a knife. "Boss, I've been with you since the beginning," Dominic said, his eyes locked on Albert's back. "I was there when we took the docks from the Russians. I was there when we survived the Triad offensive 5 years ago. I've killed for you, bled for you, and I would die for you without a second thought. But this is a mistake. You're letting a viper into the nest just because she has a pretty face and a file full of names we should have caught ourselves." Albert turned away from the window, his expression unreadable. The morning light cast his face in sharp relief, highlighting the harsh lines and shadows that came from years of carrying the weight of an empire. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an edge that made every man in the room straighten unconsciously. The names she provided were accurate. Albert said simply, "The mole has been excised. The leak has been plugged. That's not speculation or theory. That's fact. 3 men are dead because of the information she brought me. 3 men who would have continued to undermine this organization if she hadn't exposed them." He walked slowly around the table, making eye contact with each man in turn. "We've been operating blind, gentlemen. While we congratulated ourselves on our security, our enemies were reading our playbook in real time. That ends now. Julieta Chun is a resource, and I intend to use her as such. And when she decides we're no longer useful," Vincent challenged, "when someone offers her a bigger payday, what then? Then she'll discover why people don't betray the Avellino syndicate and live to spend their money," Albert replied coldly. But even as he spoke the words with absolute conviction, a cold sliver of doubt remained lodged in his chest like a splinter of ice. Was he being played? Was Julieta feeding him small victories to earn a trust she would later weaponize? The question haunted him, but he couldn't afford to show uncertainty in front of his men. A king who doubted himself was a dead king. The answer to his unspoken question came sooner than expected, and it arrived with terrifying precision. 2 nights later, a high-value shipment of untraceable currency was scheduled to move through the industrial district. The load consisted of $8 million in unmarked bills, the accumulated profits from 3 months of operations across 5 different revenue streams. It was supposed to be a routine run, one that Dominic insisted did not require the interference of an outsider. "We've been running this route for 2 years without a hitch," Dominic argued during the briefing. "We don't need her input." Albert had agreed, partly to placate his enforcer, partly to see if Julieta would insert herself into the operation anyway. It was another test, though he didn't tell Dominic that. The convoy consisted of 3 armored trucks escorted by 2 chase vehicles filled with heavily armed men. The route had been carefully planned to avoid known trouble spots and surveillance cameras. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Then, an hour before the trucks were set to roll, a coded message appeared on Albert's private terminal. The message was brief, written in the kind of shorthand that only someone intimately familiar with tactical operations would use. Triads moved ambush point. Not the bridge. The tunnel. Vehicle-borne IED designed to collapse entry. Burial, not theft. Reroute coastal bypass immediately. J. Albert stared at the message for exactly 3 seconds before his training took over. He didn't question it. He didn't call Julieta to verify. He simply picked up his encrypted phone and called Dominic. "Change of plans. Take the coastal bypass." "Boss, that adds 40 minutes to the route and takes us through 3 additional surveillance zones." "The coastal bypass. Now, that's an order." Dominic's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes, but he obeyed. 20 minutes later, he called back from a hidden observation post overlooking the original route, his voice shaking with a combination of rage and something that might have been fear. "Boss, you need to see this." From the observation post equipped with military-grade thermal imaging and night vision, Dominic watched through goggles as a triad demolition team moved into position at the tunnel entrance. There were 12 of them, professionals who moved with the kind of precision that spoke of military training. They planted shaped charges along the tunnel's support pillars, carefully calibrated to bring down tons of concrete and steel. The convoy would have entered the tunnel at exactly 2:47 a.m. The charges detonated at 2:48 a.m. The explosion was massive, a roar of fire and concrete that lit up the industrial district like a miniature sun. The tunnel entrance collapsed completely, a catastrophic failure that sent debris flying in a 100-foot radius. The blast was so powerful that it triggered car alarms 6 blocks away and shattered windows in nearby warehouses. If the convoy had been in that tunnel, all 10 men would have been buried alive under thousands of tons of rubble. The $8 million would have been lost, but more importantly, the syndicate would have lost a significant portion of its operational manpower. It would have been a devastating blow, both financially and psychologically. Dominic watched the explosion through his goggles, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. The thermal signatures of the Triad team were clear as they evacuated the area, moving quickly but not frantically. They thought they just dealt the Avellino syndicate a crippling blow. The enforcer drove back to the state in silence, his mind churning. The second tip from Julieta had saved the syndicate a fortune and preserved the lives of 10 loyal men. Men he'd worked with for years, men whose families he knew. By all logic, he should have been grateful. He should have been celebrating the Whisper's value to the organization. But instead, Dominic found himself more paranoid than ever. He burst into Albert's study without knocking, something he would never normally do. Albert was standing by his private bar, pouring a drink, the first alcohol Dominic had seen him touch in months. How did she know? Dominic demanded. "Boss, how the fuck did she know about the tunnel? We only finalized that route 6 hours before the convoy was set to roll. The Triads would have needed days to set up that kind of demolition. Unless..." He let the implication hang in the air. "Unless she told them where we'd be in the first place," Albert finished the thought. "Unless she set up the ambush and then saved us to prove her value. Is that what you're suggesting?" I'm saying it's one hell of a coincidence that she can predict triad movements with terrifying accuracy, Dominic said. I'm saying that level of intelligence suggests she's still talking to them. And if she's still talking to them, then she's playing both sides, Albert concluded. The same way she's always done. The two men stood in silence, the weight of that possibility pressing down on both of them. You want me to handle her? Dominic finally asked. The question was loaded with meaning. Handle her meant a shallow grave in an industrial district, a disappearance so complete that even the best investigators would never find a body. No, Albert said, surprising both of them. Not yet, but I want surveillance. Everything. I want to know every breath she takes, every move she makes. If she's playing us, I want proof before we act. And if she figures out we're watching her, then she's smarter than both of us, Albert replied, and we have bigger problems than we thought. Later that night, the estate was draped in a heavy, uneasy silence. The successful rerouting of the shipment had been processed, and the adrenaline of the narrow escape had faded into a lingering exhaustion. Albert found himself in the library, the only room in the house that didn't feel like a fortress. The library was his private escape, a space filled with first edition books and comfortable leather furniture that his father had collected over the years. A fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Albert was pouring himself a glass of Macallan 25, the good stuff reserved for nights when sleep seemed impossible. When he sensed a presence in the doorway, Julieta stood there, her figure silhouetted against the dim lighting of the corridor. She had traded her tactical black for a soft, silk robe in deep emerald that shimmered in the low light of the fire. She didn't look like a spy or a threat in that moment. She looked like a woman carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, someone who had finally found a place where she could let her guard down. Or at least, that's what she wanted him to think. Albert's paranoia whispered that even this moment of apparent vulnerability, was calculated. I heard the convoy was successful, Julieta said, walking into the room without waiting for an invitation. She moved with that same fluid grace, taking a seat in the velvet chair across from his desk. That's good. You have good men. They deserve to make it home to their families. Albert poured a second glass without asking if she wanted one, and pushed it toward her across the polished wood. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was a crackle and pop of the logs on the hearth and the distant whistle of the wind against the stone exterior of the estate. The professional lines, once so rigid and defined, began to blur in the amber glow of the fireplace. The atmosphere was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with two people who understood the burden of living in the shadows. Why did you stay? Albert finally asked, breaking the comfortable silence. You could have sent that warning through a dozen different channels. You could have delivered it anonymously. But instead, you stayed here in my house, surrounded by men who want you dead. Why? Julieta looked into her glass, her reflection dancing in the amber liquid. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. Do you know what it's like to spend your entire life in the margins? She asked. To be the person everyone uses but no one protects? I've been a tool my entire adult life, Albert, a means to an end. People pay me for information, but they don't see me. They see a resource, a commodity. She took a sip of the whiskey, letting it burn down her throat. You're different, she continued. You actually listened when I spoke. You treated me like a partner in that negotiation, not like a thing to be used and discarded. And I realized something in that moment. For the first time in my life, I wanted to see what happened when the king didn't fall. I wanted to be part of something that lasted instead of being the reason it ended. In that moment of shared vulnerability, Albert saw the exhaustion behind her eyes. He saw past the calculated intelligence and the carefully constructed persona to the girl underneath, a girl who had learned to survive by outthinking the monsters around her, who had turned her intelligence into armor because she had no other protection. He reached across the desk, his hand hovering near hers, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the heat of her skin. He wanted to believe her. God, how desperately he wanted to believe that this connection was real, that it wasn't just another tactical calculation in a life filled with them. But as his fingers finally brushed the silk of her sleeve, the cold logic in the back of his mind screamed a warning. He was the head of the Avellino syndicate. She was an informant. Every touch was a risk. Every confession was a potential lie. He was beginning to rely on her, leaning into the comfort of her presence, trusting her intelligence and her insights. And that, the logical part his brain whispered, was exactly what she wanted. Was he falling in love, or was he being led into the most elaborate trap ever devised? He pulled his hand back, the warmth of the moment evaporating as quickly as it had formed. Julieta noticed a shift immediately, her eyes hardening once more into the mask of the whisperer, that impenetrable facade she showed to the world. She finished her drink in one long swallow and stood up, the silk rustling as she moved toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and turned back to look at him. Her expression was unreadable in the shifting shadows. "You're wondering if I'm the one who told the triads to set the ambush in the first place, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You're wondering if I orchestrated the entire thing just to make myself look valuable?" Albert didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was confirmation enough. "Smart man," Julieta whispered, something that might have been sadness flickering across her face. "Trust is a luxury neither of us can afford, Albert. Sleep with one eye open." She disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Albert alone with the dying fire and the even colder realization that he was losing the war for his own soul. The viper was no longer just in the nest. She was in his head, coiled around his thoughts, and the poison was starting to feel like home. As the embers turned to ash, Albert realized that the next move wouldn't be played out in the streets or at the shipyards or in tactical briefings. It would be played out here, in the quiet spaces between them, where the truth was the most dangerous weapon of all. He pulled out his phone and sent a single encrypted message to Dominic. "Double the surveillance. I need to know the truth." Outside in her room in the East Wing, Julieta stood by the window and watched the ground below. She had felt the shift in Albert's demeanor, recognized a moment when doubt had crept back in. She pulled out a burner phone, one of 3 she kept hidden, and typed a message to her federal handlers. "He's suspicious. Need more time. Don't contact me directly." Then she deleted the message history, removed the SIM card, and burned it in the small candle flame on her nightstand. The plastic melted into a toxic puddle, releasing acrid smoke that smelled like everything wrong with her life. She was caught between 2 impossible choices, and the walls were closing in from both sides. The question was no longer if something would break. It was when, and how many people would die when it did. The embers in the library hearth had long since turned to cold, gray ash by the time Albert finally moved from his desk. The warning Julieta had whispered, to sleep with one eye open, echoed in the hollow silence of the estate like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. He was the king of a vast, concrete empire that stretched across every profitable vice in the city, yet he felt like a prisoner within his own mind, haunted by the silhouette of a woman who was supposed to be nothing more than a tactical asset. The tension within the house did not dissipate with the morning sun. Instead, it thickened like fog rolling in from the ocean, a heavy presence that clung to the corridors and settled in the corners of rooms. Albert knew he couldn't keep Julieta hidden in the East Wing forever, treating her like a secret shame or a weapon he wasn't ready to deploy. To truly test her loyalty, and to quiet the growing dissent among his men, he had to bring her into the light. He needed to see her function in the chaotic heart of the city, where the neon lights blurred the line between ally and enemy, where a single misstep could mean a bullet in the dark. The opportunity arrived 2 nights later, delivered in the form of an embossed invitation that looked more like a wedding announcement than a summons to a criminal summit. A high-stakes meeting was being held at the Gilded Cage, a sprawling multi-level nightclub that served as neutral ground for the city's various criminal factions. The club was owned by a consortium of interests, Italian, Russian, Chinese, and others, all of whom had agreed decades ago that the city needed at least one place where business could be conducted without immediately descending into bloodshed. The Gilded Cage was that place, a temple of excess where deals were made over $1,000 bottles of champagne and disagreements were settled with lawyers instead of bullets. At least, that was the theory. Albert was attending to secure a new distribution agreement with a faction of Eastern European smugglers who controlled shipping routes through the Baltic. It was important business, the kind that would expand the syndicate's reach into new markets. But his true objective for the evening was something else entirely: to observe the woman who would be walking beside him. As they stepped out of the armored vehicle and into the pulsing heat of the city's nightlife, the transition was jarring. They had left the quiet, controlled environment of this state, with its manicured gardens and armed security, and entered a different world entirely. The air here was thick with the scent of expensive perfume mixing with ozone from neon signs, and underneath it all, the metallic tang of hidden weapons. The street outside the gilded cage was packed with luxury vehicles and people who wore wealth-like armor. Albert looked at Julieta, and for a moment, he forgot the file, the mole, the warnings of his enforcers, and Dominic's surveillance operations. She was a vision in a gown of shimmering black silk that seemed to capture and reflect every color of light that touched it. The neon blues and pinks of the club's exterior, the warm gold of the streetlights, even the harsh white of the security floods. The dress was cut dangerously low, revealing the elegant curve of her collarbone and the hollow of her throat where her pulse beat visibly. Her hair was swept up in an intricate style that must have taken hours, secured with pins that Albert suspected could double as weapons if necessary. She moved with a lethal grace, her head held high, navigating the sea of predators with the confidence of someone who had spent her life dancing on the edge of a blade. She didn't walk. She glided, and every eye turned to follow her progress. "You look like you're going to war," Albert murmured as they approached the entrance. "Aren't I?" Julieta replied with a slight smile. "This is just a different kind of battlefield." Inside the club, the bass was a physical force, vibrating through floorboards and into Albert's bones. The gilded cage was designed to overwhelm the senses. Strobe lights cut through manufactured fog, massive screens displayed abstract art, and the crowd moved like a single organism to music that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The main floor was packed with bodies, some dancing, some conducting business, all of them dangerous in their own ways. Albert was escorted to a secluded VIP balcony that overlooked the main floor, a position that allowed him to observe everything below while remaining relatively protected. His security team formed a perimeter, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. But Albert's attention was focused on Julieta as she descended to the crowd below. He had given her a simple instruction: work the room. See what you can learn about the Eastern Europeans before the meeting. I want to know if they're serious or if this is a setup. Now he watched as she disappeared into the pulsing mass of humanity, a black silk phantom moving through a fevered dream of light and sound. Julieta was in her element. This was her natural habitat, not the quiet libraries and tactical rooms of the estate, but this chaos, this controlled madness where information flowed like the overpriced liquor. She was a whisperer, and this was where she hunted. Albert watched through the haze as she moved through the crowd with purpose disguised as casual interest. She leaned in close to contact here, a man Albert recognized as a mid-level player in the Russian protection rackets. She shared a brief, cryptic laugh with a rival there, a woman who ran a string of high-end escort services that catered to politicians and judges. Every movement was calculated, yet she made it look effortless, like a dancer who had memorized the choreography so thoroughly that it became instinct. From his vantage point, Albert found himself mesmerized. He had seen thousands of women in places like this. Beautiful women, intelligent women, dangerous women. But none possessed a razor-sharp intelligence that radiated from Julieta like heat. She wasn't just collecting information. She was weaving a web, connecting threads that others couldn't even see. And for the first time in years, Albert began to see himself clearly. The lonely man behind his own title. The man who had traded his soul for a throne and found that it was a very cold place to sit. He had built an empire, amassed wealth and power that most people couldn't even imagine. But he had done it alone, always alone, surrounded by loyal men, but never truly known by any of them. He realized that his obsession with Julieta wasn't just about the secrets she held or the intelligence she could provide. It was about the fact that she was the only person who looked at him and saw the man, not the crown. She didn't fear him the way others did. She challenged him, matched wits with him, treated him as an equal rather than as a force of nature to be avoided. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. However, beneath the shimmering surface of the night, Julieta was drowning in her own deceptions. Every time she laughed at someone's joke, Every time she whispered a piece of carefully curated intel into a contact's ear, the weight of her secret debt to the authorities felt like a physical noose tightening around her neck. She could feel the gaze of her federal handlers in every shadow, their silent demands for Avellino's blood clashing violently with the genuine, terrifying heat she felt whenever Albert was near. She was supposed to be a professional. She had spent years perfecting the art of emotional detachment, training herself to see marks instead of people, to view relationships as transactions rather than connections. But Albert had somehow bypassed all her defenses. When he looked at her with those intense eyes, when he spoke to her as an equal, when he reached across the desk as though he wanted to touch her, she felt something she had convinced herself she was incapable of feeling. She was falling for him. And in her line of work. That was a fatal mistake. Yet to come. For those few seconds, they weren't a mafia leader and an informant. They were just two people clinging to each other in a world that wanted to tear them apart. When Albert finally pulled away, his pulse was racing in a way that had nothing to do with the fight outside. He looked at Julieta, really looked at her, and saw the conflict raging behind those intelligent eyes. She looked like she wanted to scream the truth and run away at the same time. She looked like a woman balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything. "We have to go," Albert said, his voice a low, gravelly command that sounded rougher than he intended. Julieta nodded, her fingers trembling as she smoothed her hair back into place. The attraction between them was now undeniable, a physical force that had irrevocably altered the dynamic of their alliance. Whatever they had been pretending this was, a business arrangement, a tactical partnership. That pretense was gone now. They emerged from the corridor to find that Albert's security team had regrouped and neutralized the threat. The Serbs had been escorted out by the club's own security force, and an uneasy peace had been restored. But the damage was done. The summit would have to be rescheduled, and word would spread to the underworld that the Avellino syndicate had been caught off guard. As they drove back to the estate in a tense, heavy silence, Albert looked out the window at the passing neon shadows of the city. He had felt the heat of her, the reality of her press against him in that corridor, but his tactical mind was already dissecting the moment with cold precision. Was the kiss a genuine expression of feeling, or was it the ultimate tool of an informant who knew exactly how to disarm her target? Had she engineered the entire situation? Maybe even orchestrated the confrontation with the Serbs, specifically to create that moment of intimacy? Beside him, Julieta stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap, so tightly her knuckles were white. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She had kissed a man she was supposed to betray, and she knew that in the world of the syndicate, there was no room for the kind of love that started with a lie. The mission to the heart of the city had solidified their obsession, but it had also set a countdown in motion. The authorities were waiting for their payment, demanding information she hadn't yet delivered. Albert was starting to imagine a life he couldn't have, building castles in the air with a woman who might be his downfall. They were two sides of the same coin, spinning toward a conclusion that promised only fire and ruin. As the estate gates hissed shut behind them, both of them knew that something fundamental had shifted. The game had changed, and neither of them was certain of the rules anymore. The ride back from the neon chaos of the nightclub felt longer than any journey Albert had taken in years. The ghost of Julieta's kiss lingered on his lips like a brand, a sweet and terrifying reminder that his ironclad control, the foundation upon which he'd built his entire empire, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. He sat in the back seat of the armored sedan, the bulletproof glass separating them from the driver, creating an illusion of privacy. The silence between them was heavy with the weight of things unsaid, charged with an electricity that had nowhere to ground itself. Beside him, Julieta was a shadow of black silk, her profile illuminated intermittently by the passing streetlights, her expression unreadable. They were two people bound by a contract of secrets, yet in that service corridor, they had found something far more volatile than information. They had found each other. By the time the gates of the estate hissed shut behind them, sealing them back into the control world Albert had built, the atmosphere had shifted from charged to dangerous. Albert did not send Julieta back to her wing. Instead, in a decision that would have shocked Dominic and the rest of his inner circle, he led her toward the high-security archives at the very center of his fortress. The archives were located 3 levels below the main house, access through a series of biometric scanners, and reinforced doors that could withstand a direct missile strike. It was a place where few men, even those in his inner circle, were permitted to enter. The temperature was carefully controlled, the air filtered and recycled, smelling of parchment and chill electricity, and the accumulated secrets of 3 generations. If you're going to be my eyes and ears, you need to understand what you're protecting, Albert said as the final door clicked open. His voice echoed softly against the reinforced walls, carrying a vulnerability he would never have allowed in front of his men. The archives were a marvel of organization and paranoia. One wall was dominated by digital displays, showing real-time data feeds from across the city. Another held physical files, the old-fashioned kind that couldn't be hacked, organized in floor-to-ceiling cabinets. A third wall was covered with maps, shipping routes, territory boundaries, distribution networks, all marked with pins and strings that created a spider's web of connections. Albert began to walk her through the skeleton of the Avellino Syndicate, pulling up digital maps and historical ledgers, laying bare the bones of his empire. He showed her the distribution networks that fed the city like arteries carrying blood to vital organs. He explained the legacy of the men who had built the organization from nothing. His grandfather, who had come from Sicily with nothing but ambition and ruthlessness. His father, who had modernized the operation and expanded it beyond anyone's expectations. He spoke of the tactical vulnerabilities he had spent a decade trying to patch, the weak points where law enforcement had made inroads, the rival organizations that nipped at his territory like jackals around a wounded lion, the sleepless nights spent calculating risks and probabilities, trying to stay 3 steps ahead of everyone else. For the first time in his life, Albert was sharing the weight of his crown. He was exposing the burden of absolute power, the crushing isolation that came with being the man everyone feared but no one truly knew. As he walked her through the history of his family's blood and sweat and sacrifice, he felt a terrifying pull of vulnerability that he had spent years learning to suppress. He was handing her the keys to his kingdom, exposing the very nerves of his operation. It was a gamble that defied every rule of logic he possessed, that violated every principle of operational security he had learned. Yet looking at the sharp intelligence in her eyes, seeing the way she absorbed and processed information with frightening speed, he felt a desperate need to be known by someone who wasn't afraid of his shadow. Julieta watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs hard enough that she was certain he must be able to hear it. She was seeing the man behind a monster, the weary architect of a world she had only ever viewed as a paycheck. Every detail he shared was a weapon she could use to buy her freedom from the federal handlers who owned her. Every secret he revealed was ammunition that could bring down his entire organization. Yet the more he spoke, the more those potential weapons felt like lead weights in her hands, dragging her down toward a decision she wasn't ready to make. She realized, with a dawning sense of horror that felt like drowning, that she was no longer just an observer in this story. She was no longer the detached professional who could walk away without looking back. She was falling for her mark, the cardinal sin of her profession, and there was no coming back from that. The cold, calculating whisperer who had survived by never caring about anyone was being replaced by a woman who wanted to shield a man in front of her from a very storm she had helped create. The intimate silence of the archive was shattered by the sharp vibration of a burner phone hidden in Julieta's clutch. The sound was jarring the quiet space, a discordant note that brought reality crashing back. She excused herself, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her throat. Just a moment. I need to take this. She stepped into the dim hallway outside, her pulse quickening as she pulled out the phone. The message on the screen was short and devastating. Coordinates of primary distribution routes by dawn, or we reveal your involvement in triad intelligence leaks, federal prison, or cooperation. Time's up. Respond within 2 hours. Handler 7-inch. Julieta leaned her head against the cold stone wall, the weight of the debt she owed the authorities finally threatening to crush her completely. Her breath came in short gasps, panic clawing at her throat like a living thing. She looked back through the open door at Albert, who was still poring over the maps, his guard completely down for perhaps the first time in a decade. He was offering her his trust, a gift he had never given another living soul, and she was expected to trade it for her own survival. She composed herself, forcing her breathing to steady, rebuilding the mask she wore so well. When she walked back into the room, her face was a masterpiece of practiced composure, but her soul felt like it was being torn in half. Albert looked up from the tactical data he'd been reviewing, and something in his expression shifted. His eyes, which had been warm with that rare vulnerability, sharpened with suspicion. "Is everything all right?" he asked, and she heard the tactical mind reasserting itself beneath the question. He had noticed a tremor in her hands, the slight flush in her cheeks, the way her breathing was just a fraction faster than it should be. "Just the adrenaline from the club," she lied, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth. She forced herself to sit back down and look at the tactical data, memorizing the routes even as every line on the map felt like a scarf forming on her conscience. As the night bled into the early hours of the morning, the bond between them deepened, forged in the quiet honesty of the archive. Albert felt a peace he hadn't known in years, believing he had finally found someone who understood the price of power, someone who would stand beside him rather than behind him. But as he reached out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind Julietta's ear, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch, he didn't see the tears she was fighting back. He didn't see the way she looked at him as if she were already mourning him. He didn't see that she was memorizing his face, committing every detail to memory in case this was the last time she would see him as something other than a betrayal. Julieta realized that the choice ahead of her was impossible. She could save herself and burn the only man who had ever truly valued her, or she could protect him and face a life behind bars, locked away from the sun and the rain, and everything that made life worth living. The professional lines were gone, burned away in that kiss in the service corridor. They had been replaced by a dark, obsessive love that promised only tragedy. As she eventually left the archive and headed toward her room in the East Wing, the burner phone heavy in her clutch, she felt the phantom weight of the crown on her own head. She had become a part of Albert's world, and in doing so, she had ensured that no matter what she chose, someone was going to lose everything. The night was fading, gray pre-dawn light beginning to creep through the windows. Dawn would bring a decision that would either solidify Albert's reign or leave his empire in ruins. And Julieta Chun, the whisperer who had always survived by never choosing sides, would have to finally decide where her loyalty truly lay. The dawn that followed their night in the archives arrived with a pale, sickly light that offered no warmth and less comfort. As Julieta walked back to her quarters through the empty corridors of the estate, the weight of the secret she had just inherited from Albert felt like lead in her veins, poisoning her from the inside out. She could still feel the phantom touch of his fingers against her hair, a gesture of tenderness that had felt more like a brand of ownership. She had entered his inner sanctum as an informant, but she was leaving it as something far more dangerous, a woman who cared. The vibration in her clutch was a constant, nagging reminder of the world outside the estate's walls. A world that didn't care about her feelings, that saw her only as a tool to be used in bringing down one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the city. Julieta spent the morning pacing in her room like a caged animal, her mind a frantic chessboard where every move led to checkmate. The deadline from her handlers was approaching with the inevitability of an execution. She began to craft a narrative of half-truths, a desperate attempt to buy more time. She fed them old warehouse locations that Albert had already abandoned. She gave them defunct shipping schedules for routes that hadn't been used in months. She provided them with peripheral information, real enough to seem valuable, but hollow enough not to actually damage the core of Albert's operation. She was playing a lethal game of stall and distract, hoping to keep the wolves at bay without actually throwing Albert to them. But in the syndicate, suspicion was the air everyone breathed, and someone was always watching. Dominic, Albert's lead enforcer, had not slept since the convoy incident. The fact that Julieta had somehow known about the Triad ambush with such precision gnawed at him like a rat chewing through certainty. He spent his hours in the security hub, a room filled with monitors showing feeds from every camera on the property, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the playback footage, searching for proof of what his gut already knew. He didn't trust the way the boss looked at the Whisperer anymore. He had seen that look before, years ago, when Albert's younger brother had fallen for a woman who turned out to be working for the Russians. That relationship had ended with his brother's body in a shipping container, and a lesson learned in blood. Never let emotion override logic. But Albert seemed to have forgotten that lesson. Dominic could see it in the way the boss's voice softened when he spoke to her. He could see it in the way Albert's eyes followed her when she left the room. The king was compromised, and a compromised king was a dead king. Dominic's patience was rewarded when he caught a glimpse of Julieta near the edge of property during her afternoon walk, a privilege Albert had granted her despite Dominic's objections. Her silhouette was illuminated by the glow of a burner phone as she sent a message, her posture tense and furtive. The camera angle wasn't good enough to see the screen, and the audio surveillance didn't extend that far, but he had the visual evidence. She was communicating with someone outside the state. It wasn't enough to bring to Albert yet, not while the boss was blinded by his own obsession, but it was the first thread of a noose. Dominic began pulling on that thread, carefully and methodically, building a case that even love couldn't ignore. He assigned men to follow her during her authorized walks. He had technicians scan for electronic signals emanating from the East Wing. He pulled phone records from every cell tower within a mile radius, looking for patterns that might reveal who she was talking to. And slowly, piece by piece, the picture began to emerge. Julieta Chun was not the loyal asset she pretended to be. She was playing both sides, and Albert Avellino was the prize. The atmosphere within the estate became suffocating as the days passed. Every meal felt like a performance, every conversation a tactical maneuver. Albert seemed oblivious to the growing frost between his men and his guest. Or perhaps he simply chose to ignore it, too focused on the woman who had somehow become the center of his carefully ordered world. To mark what he believed was a new era of trust and partnership, Albert requested Julieta's presence in the grand hall that evening. The room was vast, a cathedral to power filled with the echoes of a dozen generations of Avellino influence. Portraits of his ancestors lined the walls, stern-faced men who had clawed their way up from nothing to build an empire. A massive fireplace dominated one end, the orange flames casting long, dancing shadows across marble floors and antique furniture. When Julieta entered, Albert was standing by the fireplace, the flames painting his face in shades of gold and shadow. He looked like a king in his castle, powerful and untouchable. But when he turned to face her, there was something vulnerable in his expression that took her breath away. He didn't greet her with a question about intelligence or a report on the triads. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet-lined box. Inside was a necklace of intricate silver work, centering on a stone that looked like a drop of frozen moonlight, a rare blue diamond, worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. But its value wasn't in the stone. Its value was in what it represented. In the syndicate, such a gift was far more than jewelry. It was a public declaration of protection and absolute trust. By giving her this, Albert was telling his men, and through them, the entire Underworld, that Julieta Chun was under the personal protection of Albert Avellino. She was untouchable. To move against her was to move against him. "I have spent my life looking over my shoulder," Albert said, his voice low and devoid of its usual clinical edge. The vulnerability in his tone made Julieta's chest ache. He stepped closer, his fingers steady as he reached around her neck to fasten the cold metal, trusting no one, questioning everything, building walls so high that even I couldn't see over them anymore. His fingers brushed against her skin as he secured the clasp, and she felt herself shiver despite the heat from the fireplace. "With you, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel like I can look forward instead of constantly watching my back," he continued. "This is a promise, Julieta. You are part of this house now, part of my world, and I protect what's mine." The irony was a physical blow to her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. As the silver rested against her skin, she felt like she was being fitted for a collar or a noose. She looked into Albert's eyes and saw a vulnerability that terrified her more than any threat ever could. He was giving her his heart on a silver platter, offering her everything he had to give, and she was currently bartering his life for her own freedom. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and the lie tasted like poison. She wanted to scream the truth, to tell him about the handlers and the debt and the half-truths and the messages demanding his destruction. She wanted to warn him that the woman he was trusting was the weapon pointed at his heart. But the words died in her throat, strangled by fear and self-preservation, and the terrible knowledge that to speak was to end everything. including possibly her own life. "You deserve beautiful things," Albert said simply, and the genuine warmth in his voice was a knife twisting in her gut. While they stood in that moment of manufactured peace, Dominic was in the shadows of the upper gallery, watching them through the scope of his own resentment. He had seen Julieta meeting a contact at a secluded park bench earlier that afternoon during one of her authorized walks. He hadn't been able to identify the man. Professional, careful, knew how to avoid cameras, but the exchange of a small flash drive had been unmistakable. Dominic had the proof now. He had photographs, timestamps, patterns of behavior that painted a clear picture, but he knew that presenting this evidence to Albert in his current state would be pointless. The boss was in love, or whatever twisted version of love existed in their world, and love made men blind and stupid. No, Dominic needed more than evidence of contact. He needed to show Albert exactly what was being sold. He needed the smoking gun, the actual intelligence she was passing, proof of the betrayal so clear that even obsessive love couldn't deny it. So he waited and he watched, and he prepared for the moment when the whisperer would finally slip up and give him what he needed. The escalation was no longer a slow burn. It was a wildfire consuming everything in its path. The authorities were losing patience with Julieta's diversions, sending increasingly threatening messages. Dominic was closing in on the truth, building his case with methodical precision. Inside the estate, the walls seemed to lean in, heavy with the weight of betrayal that was now inevitable. Albert was building a future on a foundation of shifting sand, and Julieta was the one pouring water on it, watching it dissolve even as she desperately tried to hold it together. As they sat for dinner that night in the formal dining room, a long table that could seat 20 but held only 2, the silver necklace caught the candlelight, throwing sparkles across the walls like trapped stars. Albert raised a glass of wine to her, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He looked younger in that moment, less like the ruthless king of the underworld, and more like the man he might have been in a different life. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice warm. "To trust," Julieta replied, her voice barely steady, and she hated herself for the mockery of those words. The silence that followed was no longer comfortable. It was a countdown, a ticking clock measuring the seconds until everything exploded. The federal pressure was at its peak, and the whisper was running out of lies to tell. The next few hours would determine if the Avellino syndicate would stand or if it would fall to the beauty of a lie. As the candles burned low and the wine bottle emptied, neither of them knew that the walls were already closing in, that Dominic had already set events in motion that couldn't be stopped. The storm was coming, and when it broke, it would wash away everything they had built in blood and secrets and impossible love. The glass of wine Albert had raised in a toast was still half full on the mahogany table when the world ended. The rare smile he had shared with Julieta was the last ghost of peace they would ever know together. It happened exactly 42 minutes after they had retired from the Grand Hall, just as the heavy silver necklace had begun to feel like a permanent part of Julieta's skin, a collar marking her as his. The first explosion didn't happen at the estate. It happened miles away, at the primary distribution hub that Albert had revealed to her in the sanctity of the archives 3 nights ago. A location so secret that only 5 people in the entire organization knew its exact coordinates. But the shockwave reached them through the frantic buzzing of Albert's secure line. Albert was out of bed before the second vibration ended, his transformation instantaneous and terrifying to witness. The man who had looked at Julieta with soft vulnerability vanished, replaced by the king whose kingdom was under siege. He stood in the center of the room wearing only sleep pants, his muscled torso tense with controlled violence, his eyes scanning security feeds on the wall-mounted monitors. Red light bathed the room as the estate's tactical alarms began to wail. A rhythmic, screaming sound that signaled a total breach of the syndicate's perimeter. This wasn't a drill. This was war. "They found the hub," Albert said, his voice a low, terrified vibration that made Julieta's blood run cold. He didn't look at her yet. He was watching the screens as federal units moved with surgical precision through the warehouse district, seizing assets that had been hidden for a decade. Coordinate 42. The location I only accessed once. With you, 3 days ago. The implications hung in the air like a death sentence. Julieta stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the strobing red lights of the estate's external sensors. Her face was a mask of pale horror, her hands trembling at her sides. To any observer, she looked like a victim of the chaos, caught in a nightmare not of her making. But Albert was not just any observer. He was a man who had survived by understanding the mathematics of betrayal, who could calculate probabilities and read micro-expressions with the precision of a machine. He watched the way her hands trembled, not with fear for her life, but with the frantic energy of a person watching a fuse they had lit reach the powder keg. "Albert, we have to move," she whispered, her voice cracking with genuine panic. "We need to get out of here. Now." "We aren't moving anywhere," he replied, turning toward her slowly, "until I understand how a ghost location, a coordinate that existed only in encrypted files accessed 3 days ago, became a federal target in under 72 hours. His eyes bored into hers, and she felt herself being dissected, analyzed, judged by that brilliant tactical mind. "Tell me how, Julieta." The evacuation plan went into effect with military efficiency. Dominic and the inner circle fought a desperate rearguard action, holding the state gates against the incoming federal forces, while Albert steered Julieta toward a nondescript armored vehicle hidden in the underground garage. Gunfire echoed through the halls. Sharp cracks that spoke of lives ending, of loyalty being paid for in blood. They tore through the back roads, the city's neon lights blurring into long, accusing streaks of blue and pink. Albert drove with lethal intensity, his hands gripping the wheel hard enough to make the leather creak, his mind replaying every moment in the archives, every secret he had whispered into her ear, every weakness he had exposed. They reached a secluded safe house in the industrial district within 20 minutes, a concrete bunker designed for exactly this scenario, the darkest of days when the empire was under siege and trust was a commodity more valuable than gold. The air inside was cold and smelled of damp earth and old oil, of preparation for disasters that were supposed to remain theoretical. As a heavy steel door hissed shut behind them, the sound of sirens remained audible, a distant, persistent wail that signaled the noose was tightening around everything he had built. Albert didn't go to the weapon rack. He didn't check the perimeter cameras. He walked straight to a tactical gear bag and pulled out a specialized frequency scanner, a device designed to detect electronic transmitters, the kind used by law enforcement to track high-value targets. He finally looked at Julieta, and his gaze was so cold it felt like being stabbed with icicles. "You told me once that information is never free," Albert said, his voice echoing against the concrete walls. He activated the device, and a low, rhythmic hum filled the room, a steady pulse that felt like a ticking clock counting down to her execution. "I want to see what price you really put on my head." Julieta backed against the wall as he approached, the scanner held between them like a weapon. Her eyes were wide, her breathing rapid, every instinct screaming at her to run, even though there was nowhere to go. "Albert, please." "Don't," he cut her off, his voice sharp as a blade. "Don't lie to me anymore. I want the truth. For once in your miserable, lying life, give me the fucking truth." As he swept the scanner over her body, the hum remained steady, until he reached her throat. The device's pitch changed suddenly, turning from a low hum into a sharp, piercing shriek that was physically painful to hear. Albert stopped. The world stopped. He moved the scanner closer to where the silver necklace rested against her skin, and the shriek became a continuous, deafening alarm that made his teeth ache. The visceral sting of the betrayal hit him harder than any bullet ever could. It was a physical pain in his chest, as though something vital had been ripped out of him. His hand trembled, the first time in years that his legendary control had failed him, as he reached out and grabbed the necklace. Julieta gasped as he ripped the jewelry from her neck with brutal force. The silver clasp snapped, drawing a thin line of red across her pale skin like a wound. Albert didn't hesitate, didn't allow himself to feel remorse for hurting her. He smashed the central stone against the edge of a steel table, the sound of breaking crystal sharp in the enclosed space. The diamond shattered, revealing its secret heart. There, nestled in the hollow chamber where a gemstone should have been, was a microscopic transmitter, military grade, probably worth more than the fake jewelry that housed it. "You didn't just sell the routes," Albert whispered, his voice barely audible over the shrieking alarm. He held the crushed transmitter between his thumb and forefinger like a dead insect, staring at it with a kind of fascination usually reserved for car accidents. You used the only piece of myself I ever gave you to lead them directly to my door. You turned my trust into a tracking device. Julieta backed against the wall until she could go no further, her eyes wide and brimming with tears she could no longer suppress. Outside, the sirens were no longer distant. They were right outside the gate, accompanied by the sound of a federal ram hitting the outer door. Heavy, rhythmic impacts that vibrated through floorboards like a dying heartbeat. "Albert, I didn't know they put it in there," she cried out, her voice raw with desperation. "I swear to God, I didn't know. I was feeding them half-truths to buy us time. I was trying to protect you. I was going to tell you tonight. I swear." "Tell me what?" Albert roared, his control finally shattering completely. He cornered her against the cold concrete, looming over her, his presence overwhelming. "Tell me after I was in handcuffs? After I was dead? Tell me when, Julieta? When exactly were you planning to stop lying?" The ramming continued, each impact louder than the last. The federal forces were coming, and they were coming fast. Within minutes, this bunker would be breached and everything Albert had built would be ashes. "I was supposed to bring you down," Julieta screamed, her composure finally breaking completely. "They owned me before I ever met you. I had debts, warrants, things in my past that would have buried me forever. They gave me a choice. Help them destroy you or spend the rest of my life in a cell. So I chose survival like I always have. That's what I do, Albert. I survive." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, her carefully constructed mask shattered beyond repair. "But then I got to know you. I saw the man behind the monster. I saw the weight you carry, the loneliness, the impossible burden of that crown. And I started falling for you. That was never part of the plan. That was never supposed to happen." Albert stood frozen, the transmitter still in his hand, watching the woman he loved. Because yes, he loved her, and that made this so much worse. Fall apart in front of him. The sound of the breach was deafening now, the outer door giving way with a metallic shriek. The climax had arrived, the moment of truth where every decision mattered, where one wrong move would end everything. Albert Avellino stood in the shadows with the woman who had destroyed him, his heart stolen and his empire burning. As the world came to take what was left, the vibration of the federal ram against the outer door felt like a heartbeat, heavy, hollow, rhythmic, pulsing through the soles of Albert's boots and up through his bones. The silver transmitter he had crushed beneath his thumb was a cold piece of evidence, a tiny metallic corpse that proved the woman standing before him was a lie wrapped in silk and deception. He didn't look at the tactical screens showing the perimeter being overrun by federal agents. He didn't calculate escape routes or defensive positions. He looked only at Julieta, and in his hand, previously empty, now appeared his weapon. A Sig Sauer P2-26, the same gun he'd carried for a decade, the same gun that had ended more lives than he could count. Slowly, with rhythmic precision that betrayed the agony ripping him apart inside, Albert raised the weapon and leveled the barrel at the center of her chest, right above the spot where the silver necklace had rested moments before. The tactical part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through gang wars and political maneuvering and 1,000 lethal situations, screamed the logic at him. She was an informant. She had betrayed the syndicate. The law was absolute. Informants died. There were no exceptions, no appeals, no mercy. Was any of it real? Albert asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet carried over the growing roar of the sirens and the shouting outside. The nights in the archives, the kiss in the nightclub, the way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching. Was it all just theater? A performance designed to keep the king distracted while you fitted him for a coffin? Julieta didn't move. She didn't look at the gun. Her eyes were locked onto his. And for the first time since he'd met her, the mask of the whisperer was completely gone. She looked raw, stripped of her cleverness and her half-truths, standing before him as the broken woman she'd been hiding all along. "The debt was real, Albert," she confessed, her voice trembling but certain. "I didn't choose to come to you. The authorities owned me before I even knew your name. They had leverage on my past. Things I did to survive when I was younger and stupider. That would have buried me in a federal prison for the rest of my life. I was supposed to be a ghost, a tool they could use to bring you down and then discard. She took a small, tentative step forward. Even as Albert's finger tightened on the trigger, the sound of the breach was getting louder. They had maybe 2 minutes before federal agents would flood this room. But then I saw you, she continued, her voice breaking. Not the king, not the legend. You, the man who carries the weight of 1,000 souls on his shoulders. The man who's so lonely he's forgotten what it feels like to be truly known by someone. I saw the price you pay every single day for that crown, and Her voice caught, and she had to force the words out. I started falling for you, Albert. My feelings became the only truth I had left in a life built entirely on lies and deceptions and survival at any cost. I started falling for you, and that was never part of the plan. That was never supposed to happen. Albert's hand didn't shake, but his heart felt like it was being crushed by an invisible vice. He had spent his entire adult life perfecting emotional control, teaching himself to separate feeling from action, to make the hard decisions without flinching. But nothing, not the deaths he'd ordered, not the betrayals he'd avenged, not the weight of building an empire, nothing had prepared him for this. He lived by the law of the syndicate, a code written in blood over 3 generations. Betrayal was a terminal offense. Informants were executed immediately, publicly, as a message to anyone else who might consider selling out the organization. If Dominic or any of his men were in this room, they would have ended her life before she finished her first sentence. His loyalty to his men, to his legacy, to the throne he had bled for, required him to pull the trigger. It was the only logical choice, the only decision that preserved the integrity of the organization. But logic had abandoned him somewhere between the archives and this moment. You led them here, Albert reminded her, his voice hardening. You gave them the keys to my house. You turned my gift, my promise of protection, into the weapon that destroyed me. I tried to stop them. Julieta cried out, her desperation finally breaking through. I've been working on a double cross for weeks. I was feeding the feds corrupted data, building a legal trap that would compromise their entire investigation and buy you the time you needed to disappear. I had a plan to expose their methods, to burn their case from the inside. I was going to give you an out. Tears streamed down her face, cutting tracks through the dust and concrete residue. But I was too late, she whispered. They moved faster than I anticipated. They didn't trust me anymore. They knew I was protecting you instead of burying you. So they planted that transmitter in the necklace without telling me, tracking you through the very symbol of your trust. The sounds of the breach were deafening now. The outer steel doors groaned and buckled under the assault. The first flashbangs detonated in the entryway, filling the safe house with disorienting white light and the acrid smell of explosive compounds. They were out of time. Albert stood at the ultimate crossroads of his life, and he could see both paths with crystal clarity. On one side was the Syndicate's law, the cold, logical path that ensured his survival and maintained his honor among the Brotherhood of Thieves. Pull the trigger, end the betrayer, die as a king who never compromised. On the other side was his heart, a part of him he thought he had buried years ago when his father died, now beating desperately for the woman who had brought him to the edge of ruin. He looked at Julieta, really looked at her, and saw not just the informant who had stolen his secrets. He saw the woman who had stolen his heart and offered him a glimpse of a life he never thought he could have, a life where he wasn't alone, where someone knew him completely and chose to stay anyway. She wasn't just an informant playing a role. She was a mirror reflecting the man he used to be before the crown became a cage. The choice was visceral, primitive, operating on a level far below logic. To kill her was to kill the only part of himself that still felt human, the only part that remembered what it meant to connect with another person beyond strategic alliances and blood oaths. To save her was to betray every man who had ever died for the Avellino name, to spit on the legacy his father had built. Albert, the back exit, Julieta urged, reaching out for him even though the gun was still pointed at her heart. The tunnel beneath the garage. The feds don't know about it yet. I never told them. We have maybe 3 minutes before they seal the entire block. We can still make it. Albert lowered the weapon slowly, but he didn't holster it. His other hand reached up to touch his chest, right over his heart, as though checking to see if it was still beating. The law demanded blood. His soul demanded her. He looked at the broken necklace on the floor, at the crushed transmitter, at the woman who had broken him so completely he no longer recognized himself. And then, in the chaos of flashing lights and screaming sirens and the end of everything he had built, the king of the syndicate made his decision. He wasn't choosing loyalty to the empire anymore. He was choosing the truth of the woman in front of him, flawed and desperate and real. He was choosing the possibility of redemption over the certainty of revenge. "If you're lying to me again, Julieta," Albert said, his voice cold but his eyes burning with desperate intensity, "then the feds won't be the ones who find you. I will. And what I do to traitors will make federal prison look like mercy." He grabbed her hand, his grip firm and possessive, and pulled her toward the shadows of the rear corridor where the escape tunnel waited. The emotional standoff had ended, but the consequences were just beginning as they vanished into the dark, leaving the burning remains of the Avellino legacy behind. Albert knew he had crossed a line he could never cross back. He had chosen love over loyalty, and in his world, that was the most dangerous gamble any man could make. Behind them, federal agents flooded the safe house, only to find it empty. Above them, Dominic fought his last stand at the estate gates, going down in a hail of gunfire, still believing his boss would honor the code. And ahead of them, in the darkness of the tunnel, lay an uncertain future built on the ashes of everything they had both sacrificed. The damp, narrow tunnel beneath the safe house smelled of wet concrete, rust, and decades of forgotten secrets. As Albert pulled Julieta through the dark, their footsteps echoing against the curved walls, the muffled thud of the federal breach above them signaled the death of the Avellino syndicate. An empire 3 generations in the making, collapsing in a single night. Every step away from the surface was a step away from the life he had built with blood and calculation. Every breath in this underground passage was paid for the lives of men who had trusted him, who had believed he would never compromise, who had died thinking he was still the king they had sworn to serve. The tunnel was a contingency plan his father had built decades ago, an escape route known only to the head of the family. It stretched for nearly a mile, emerging in a rental garage in a district so far removed from syndicate operations that even Dominic hadn't known about it. When they finally emerged into the cool night air of a distant alleyway, gasping and covered in concrete dust, the city skyline was still dominated by the flickering blue and red lights of the raid happening miles away. Albert did not stop moving. He couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to think about what he'd done and what it meant. He moved with the cold, surgical efficiency that had made him a king, but his eyes were no longer on the horizon of his empire. They were on the woman whose hand he refused to let go, the woman who had destroyed everything and somehow become the only thing that mattered. The resolution began in the back seat of a second vehicle hidden in the rental garage, a nondescript sedan that looked like it belonged to a middle manager, not a crime lord. Albert knew that to save Julieta, and to save himself from the mob justice that would come when his men learned what he'd done, the syndicate had to believe she was dead. Dominic and the remaining loyalists would never accept a leader who had spared an informant. To them, mercy wasn't compassion, it was weakness. And weakness was a contagion that led to the total collapse of everything they'd built together. If they knew he'd let her live, they would hunt them both to the ends of the earth. So Albert spent the next few hours orchestrating a masterpiece of deception that would have impressed even Julieta. He contacted Dominic via a secure one-way channel, his voice sounding hollow and ragged. The voice of a man who had just done something that destroyed part of his soul. "It's done," Albert said simply, and the weight of those 2 words carried across the encrypted connection like a funeral bell. "I handled the Viper. She's dead. I executed her in the safe house before the feds breached. Her body was lost in the collapse when they brought the ceiling down." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Dominic's voice, rough with emotion that might have been grief or might have been relief. "Boss, I'm sorry it came to that, but you did what had to be done. The syndicate will remember." "Yeah," Albert replied, his throat tight. "They'll remember." To satisfy the bloodlust of his men and make the lie convincing, Albert staged evidence at a secondary location, An abandoned warehouse that was already scheduled for demolition. He planted a blood-soaked scrap of red silk, torn from the dress Julieta had worn on that first night at the shipyard. He left the shattered remains of the silver necklace, crushed and broken beyond repair. He even fired several rounds into the walls at the correct angles to suggest an execution. It was theater, but it was theater he'd learned from the best. His father had taught him that sometimes the most important lies were the ones you told your own people. He was making a move that changed the syndicate forever. By killing Julieta, he was effectively killing his own legitimacy as the undisputed king. He was choosing a life of permanent exile, a shadow existence where he would no longer rule, but simply survive, always looking over his shoulder for the day when the truth caught up with them. As the first light of dawn began to gray the edges of the city, turning the sky from black to slate to that peculiar pale blue that precedes sunrise, Albert and Julieta stood on the deck of a private vessel cutting through the dark waters of the harbor. The boat was small, unregistered, owned through so many shell corporations that even the best investigators would need months to trace it back to him. It was stocked with supplies, cash, and everything they would need to disappear. Another contingency plan, another escape route prepared for a disaster he never thought would actually happen. The city that had once been his kingdom was shrinking behind them, becoming a labyrinth of neon and concrete that grew smaller with every nautical mile. The estate where he'd built his empire, the streets where he'd enforce his law, the docks where he'd first met the woman standing beside him, all of it fading into memory. Albert stood at the railing, the cold morning wind whipping through his hair, salt spray misting his face. He looked at Julieta, who was wrapped in a heavy coat several sizes too large, her face pale but her eyes no longer filled with the frantic terror of the safe house. She looked at him with a haunting realization that they both shared. They had escaped the law and the syndicate, but they had not escaped themselves. Love in their world did not wash away the sins they had committed. It didn't erase the names in that first file or the men who had died because of their proximity to the throne. The innocent people caught in the crossfire, the families destroyed by the syndicate's operations, the lives Albert had ended in building his empire. None of that disappeared just because he'd chosen to save one woman. Instead, their love made those sins permanent. It was a heavy, indestructible bond forged in the fires of betrayal and sacrifice, a chain that would connect them forever whether they wanted it or not. They were two survivors bound by a secret that could still destroy them both if the truth ever surfaced. Julieta stepped closer to him, her shoulder brushing his, as they both stared at the disappearing coastline. For the first time since that night at the shipyard, there were no transmitters, no hidden files, no federal handlers waiting in the shadows with demands and threats. There was only the vast, indifferent ocean and the man who had traded an empire for her life. "You lost everything for me," Julieta whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine and the cry of gulls following the boat. "I lost the crown I was tired of wearing," Albert replied, his gaze fixed on the fading shoreline, watching the sun begin to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "But we're both marked now, Julieta. We're ghosts. We can never go back. We can never be who we were." "I know," she said softly. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For the lies, for the betrayal, for putting you in an impossible position. I'm sorry for being the weapon they used against you." Albert was quiet for a long moment, processing everything that had happened, everything he'd lost and everything he'd chosen to keep. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. He no longer tried to hide. "You were also the only real thing I had," he said. "In a life built entirely on strategic alliances and calculated risks and bloody compromises, you were the one thing that felt true. Even with all the lies, even with the betrayal, what I felt for you was real. That's what made it so dangerous." The final image of them was one of chilling symmetry, a tableau that would haunt anyone who knew their story. They stood together against the rising sun, two sides of the same coin. One a leader who had abandoned his law, the other an informant who had found the one truth she couldn't sell. They were a paradox of trust and deception, bound together by chains forged from both love and guilt. They were moving toward a horizon that offered no guarantees of safety, no promise of redemption, only the cold comfort of each other's presence and the shared burden of their survival. The Avellino syndicate was gone, reduced to headlines and ashes, its territories carved up by rival factions within weeks. The estate burned in a tragic electrical fire that everyone knew was arson, but no one could prove. Dominic was killed in the federal raid, dying as he had lived, loyal to the end, believing in a king who had already abandoned the throne. The story of the leader and the whisperer became a legend in the dark corners of the city, whispered about in the kind of places where criminals gathered to share war stories. Some said Avellino had gone soft, that a beautiful informant had destroyed the most powerful syndicate in the city through nothing more than pillow talk and strategic seduction. Others said it differently, that he'd seen through her deception and ended her before vanishing into the wind, too disgusted by the betrayal to continue ruling. No one knew the truth, that they were both alive, both free, and both prisoners of the choice they'd made in that concrete bunker. They were last seen, though no one knew it was them, boarding a flight to Buenos Aires using flawless false identities. From there, the trail went cold. Some said they settled in a quiet coastal town in South America, living under assumed names, forever looking over their shoulders. Others claimed they separated, unable to bear the weight of what they'd done to each other. A few romantics insisted they found peace together, that love could heal even wounds as deep as theirs. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. They were free, yet they would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, knowing that the price of their silence was the very world they had left behind. Every face in a crowd could be an assassin. Every knock on the door could be the moment their past finally caught up with them. Trust, the thing that had both saved and destroyed them, remained an impossible luxury, a risk too great to take with anyone except each other. And so they remained together, bound by a love that was born in lies and sealed in blood, two ghosts haunting each other through whatever remained of their lives. It wasn't the fairy tale anyone imagined. It wasn't redemption or salvation or a clean slate. It was survival. And in the world they came from, sometimes survival was the best you could hope for. As the sun fully rose over the ocean, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson that looked like fire spreading across the surface, Albert Avellino put his arm around Julieta Chun, and they turned their backs on everything they had been. The king and the whisperer had become something new. Two people who had nothing left but each other, and the terrible knowledge that sometimes love isn't enough to wash away the blood. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough to keep living for.